I'm, I'm very, very happy that Bob is with us, and I know that you will learn a great deal about Marxism and its new renaissance, because a lot of us are being... Bob Ware, thank you very much, Bob.
I really appreciate Cliff and Bob and Betsy and all of you in the centers giving me this time to give a first presentation of my book. I'm happy to do it here rather than the later presentations in Ottawa that I'm going to give. This book that I'm going to be speaking about is actually copyright 2019, so it hasn't been around long, but it actually came out a couple of months ago. I guess I should say just one thing that I think I actually mentioned in this book too about the beginning of analytical Marxism. I think Jerry Cohn was a little too bold in saying that he was, and a couple of other guys were the leaders. Because in those early days, well, he was first supervisee of Gilbert Ryle's about a year or two before I did my dissertation at Gilbert Ryle's Oxford. But in those early days, there was the Radical Philosophy Association, which was at the foundation of the center here later on, which was very active. There are a lot of North American philosophers talking about philosophy from the analytical school, which I very much was trained in. As you mentioned, John Rawls, I was fortunate that he was my first philosophy teacher, and then I had a lot of other good philosophy teachers along the way. I'll start at the beginning. Karl Marx is important. He must be read. I want people to read him. That's what my book is about. Many criticize him, and I have criticisms too, but I think many just don't understand what he said. And of course, the question is, how do they criticize him when they don't understand what he said? Engels once told Marx, I think it was in letters, but Engels said to Marx that people are criticizing you for such and such. I've forgotten the details. And Marx replied, don't they read? He wanted people to read his work, and that's what I want to encourage in what I've written here as well. Some people say that history and biography are important to the ideas that are being discussed in order to understand the ideas. So here is the barest sketch of some of the history and biography. I have a few passages that I'll read from time to time here in the book itself. I start out, at the age of 17, Karl Marx set off from Trier, a small and ancient city in western Prussia, although recently a part of France, where he was born in May 1818. So you probably already know that 2018 was the bicentennial of his birth, and there are many books written in the last year on Marx, because of the interest in Marx that Bob was talking about, but also as occasion that people were thinking especially about Marx. He left for university studies first in Bonn and soon afterwards in Berlin. And he went to study law, but as he wrote to his father, who wanted him to continue in law, he felt, and Marx said, he felt the urge to wrestle with philosophy. I think this is what happened for the rest of his life, too, that he was wrestling with philosophy. And not enough has been done on that wrestling that he did. He immersed himself in the work of Hegel, as Bob mentioned, the great German philosopher, who at his death, Hegel's death in 1831, had left an elaborate and complex system of ideas about concepts and change that dominated the philosophical and intellectual landscape of the time. So Marx knew a lot about Hegel, but he also joined the left-wing critiques of Hegel's as well. And there was a continuing discussion and, as Marx said, coquetting with dialectics that I talk about a bit in my book. But I'm going to save you from all that stuff about methodology today. I want to talk about other philosophical interests that one might have. But keep in mind that Marx wrote his dissertation, his PhD dissertation in philosophy, on Greek philosophy. So he was steeped in philosophy and involved in philosophy in a lot of different ways. In 1843, he married his aristocratic wife, Jenny von Westphalen, who was 4 years his senior. And the two of them ran from country to country as he was evicted for his ideas in philosophy and politics, and finally took refuge in London, where they lived the rest of their lives primarily in poverty until Marx died in 1883. His wife predeceased him by a couple of years. They were aided, as some of you may know, by Friedrich Engels, who was managing a branch mill, industrial plant in Manchester of his father's German company. So Engels was very familiar with the workers and with the scene in England as Marx arrived there. They had met briefly on the continent before, and they then became firm friends and intellectual comrades in a lot of different ways. There are interesting stories about that. But it's interesting to look at the conditions of the time and think about what was going on as Engels arrived in, was 1843 or something like that, and Marx then arrived in something like 1849. But Engels wrote an important book on the condition of the working class in England in the 1840s. And he recognized the things that the workers were thinking about and knew. And amongst other things, Engels, who incidentally lived from 1820 to 1895, just to get the relative years, he outlived Marx by about 12 years. Engels knew the working class, and he knew that they knew the radical work of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. And I want to just read a part of Shelley that Engels talked about, that the workers knew by heart in those days. Shelley wrote a poem called The Mask of Anarchy, and it ends in a way that Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, talked about Shelley too, but it ends with, "Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." These are the last lines of The Mask of Anarchy. And as Engels said, the workers knew these lines by heart. The bosses knew nothing about this part of Shelley's because of the ways in which it was censored. Well, as you probably know, Marx and Engels co-wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848 at a time of revolution throughout Europe. And it still remains one of the best manifestos and the best summary of what Marx and Engels were talking about. I'm going to say much more about Marx. There may be questions about Engels because there have been questions about Engels, although I think very highly of him. There's sometimes there's a lot of criticism of of him too. But this was an important time in the 19th century. Capital was written in the mid-19th century, shortly after the revolutions, which didn't solve anything in 1848. But Marx wrote his magnum opus in economics called Capital, at the same time that Charles Darwin wrote about evolutionary developments in species. It was a great time for science in the last half of the 19th century, across the field of all different disciplines. And Marx was working on this, especially in economics, but interested in other parts too. It is interesting about Marx, though, in the publications, that the most philosophical work that he did, remember he was looking in the backdrop or landscape of Hegel, who was very philosophical. The most philosophical work that Marx did wasn't published until the mid-1900s, really about 1960, when there was a Grundrisse, an important philosophical political economic text, and the work of the Paris manuscripts on alienation. All were very influential afterwards. But Stalin knew nothing of these writings. Also, all of the communist leaders in Europe and even elsewhere knew nothing about these philosophical aspects of Marx. So there's philosophy to be mined in what Marx had to say. And that's what I want to do, and tried to do in this book. I want us to read him carefully. And there's some important areas where I think, I'm going to mention a couple of them, where I think we can see Marx should be interpreted in different ways. But just as a quick point about how I see Marx, which I think is very different from many interpretations, is, as I say in my preface, Marx is often thought of as the proponent of violence, blood, overthrow, and tyranny. It is just the opposite. That is what he thought he found in bourgeois rule, or bourgeois dictatorship, as he sometimes called it. He advocated universal suffrage, democracy, and free association of free people in a creative and productive community. That's what I try to argue in various places here. But a lot of the points I want to make turn on linguistic issues, issues of ideas and concepts, where I think Marx has been badly misinterpreted, mistranslated, sometimes intentionally misunderstood. So here I'll start with a few things about how I think Marx should be read and how he has been read, to see some of the differences. Just a few morsels about this, and I'll go over it quickly with some of them. The first thing that I did decades ago on Marx was on the division of labor. This was when some of his philosophical work was coming out, and the argument was and has been that in communist society in the future there will be no division of labor. The division of labor will be abolished. I'll make just one footnote about this. There is a subtle thing throughout Marx and philosophical issue of two different words, terminology in Marx's work that mean abolish. One is abschaffen, which means abolish. The other is aufheben, which means, I'm told these days, it means abolish primarily. But in Marx's reading, he was using Hegel, and it means changing around, transcending, and finding something better than what we had before. So we don't have what we had before, we find something that transcends that. So it's important to look at the German sometimes. Marx often wrote in English as well, so after he developed his English in England. But he also wrote in French and then developed a few other languages. He spoke 7 or 8 languages, not as good as Engels, who had 13 or 14 languages. I think these were people who did their intellectual work. I spent a lot of time on a division of labor. This didn't make sense that this brilliant man who was interested in technology said that there would be no division of labor. He'd say, we must get rid of the division of labor. Well, there are 2 ways to read that. We must get rid of, in general, the division of labor, just generally. Or, in particular, we must get rid of the division of labor that we find in society today, in capitalism, and have a new division of labor. I won't bore you with all of the texts that I looked at. I think it's the latter. We get rid of the capitalist division of labor that he was talking about. So, sponge out that interpretation of Marx, that there'll be no division of labor in the future. Another linguistic point that I've worked on, again, I'll make it quickly here. A central part of Marx was called historical materialism. The general idea was that at the fundamentals of society, you find an economy, and history develops as the economy develops. And capitalism has developed because of the developing economy. This is what Jerry Cohen wrote about in a whole book that really established that Marx could be considered by analytical philosophers. In that text, and I think too much in Cohen, in fact, although he makes some changes later on, he takes too much out of the idea that's very common in Marxist thinking, that according to Marx, as capitalism develops, the relations of production develop in a way that develops the economy as a whole. And then they become fetters on the economy. That's taken, this is a small issue, but it's taken as an enormous issue that socialism has to develop more than capitalism. And it's only when society can get to the stage where the economy is more developed will you be able to have socialism. But the fine point is that Marx said they become fetters on the forces, not fetters on the development of the forces. So Stalin had a view, well, I guess it was Khrushchev in the end who banged his shoes on the table at the UN and said, we will bury capitalism with our development. That wasn't what Marx was after. That's what I argue in the book here, that the point is not developing even more, it's developing a freer economy. Capitalism did the development. Marx was very positive in some ways about capitalism. It was a phenomenal development of the economy, but with great oppression, exploitation, and so on. His view was socialism could take all that up, and maybe they'll develop a bit more, but they can free society in a new economy. So that's a linguistic lesson, I think, a tiny point, in a way, of where the modifier is. It fetters the forces. It doesn't fetter the development of the forces. That's what I want to argue. Here's a third morsel from, I mean, this is my philosophizing about what Marx was up to. Some of you may have heard that Marx was against nations and against nationalism. He was an internationalist. He didn't believe that there would be nations. And you find that throughout communist writings since Marx's day, that we need an international. We don't need the nationalism that we find in societies. And indeed, there was a problem and a great disappointment to socialists in the early part of the 20th century, when in the Great War, the First Great War, 1914-18, the workers stayed with their nations, basically. They didn't revolt against all nationalism and form an internationalism. But what I argue here is the simple thing. You know what internationalism is. It's understood in various ways, but it's connecting together different nations. It's about nations getting together. There being nations, not about there no longer being nations, as many communists and communist imperialists, I suppose, if that makes any sense at all, would say. This comes from a passage. Let me get this right in 117 in my book. It comes from the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels say national differences and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing as they see the proletarian communist development of things. And people have taken from this that there'll no longer be national differences. So nations won't be different, and we'll have a global world without nations. Well, balderdash, I'd say. You might say that too. There's a strange sort of thing. Here's a translational problem. That you have to look at the original. The Communist Manifesto was written in German. The word is Absonderungen, which really means something like divisions. And the English should bring this out anyway. It says national differences and antagonisms. I can say my differences with my colleague have been overcome, and we have less and less, fewer and fewer differences. Yeah, it's acceptable translation, but differences doesn't mean that we don't look different. He has black hair, I have gray hair, or whatever it might be. We have divisions, splits, and antagonisms, as it comes out in English. So I have a lot of discussion then about the importance of nations. I even say, some people object to this, but I have returns on it, that Marx was a nationalist, in the sense that nations are important. The workers are going to work through nations, even in late communism. I see no reason for Marx saying anything otherwise. So there's another little complication that arises. Here I've been working on single words, like what he said about nations, what he said about fetters and so on. There's some issues, and I'll spend most of the rest of the time on what I think is a more difficult phenomenon to deal with in interpretation of Marx, and that is about the democratic Marx. What people would say, even good writers on Marx will say he didn't write about democracy. He didn't think democracy was important. You have to have another kind of society, and democracy wasn't his concern, because he made very clear statements about how awful democracy was, that democracy had this litany of rights and electoral, universal suffrage and all that sort of thing. This is what you find in bourgeois democracy. He would say throughout his writings, there's a lot of writing about that. It's a little bit like the division of labor again here too. That's their democracy, the bourgeois democracy. But democracy means, as part of the logic, Marx says after talking about the litany of democracy, he says part of the logic to have universal suffrage. You have to have universal suffrage. Engels said very early on, he was saying to the workers, the only way we're going to avoid violence is by having universal suffrage. And Marx says something much later on, well, they said in between in the Communist Manifesto, we first have to win the battle of democracy. That's a quote from the manifesto that people don't attend to very much. And Marx later on said in some countries, like the United States, and he said maybe Holland, where he was speaking, he didn't know it that well, there would be a peaceful transition to a new society. But democracy, as it was known then, had a lot of illusions and delusionary aspects to it, and was limited in a lot of ways. Of course, women couldn't vote, but Marx wanted universal suffrage, and he didn't say it was universal male suffrage. It was very clear from other things he said, universal suffrage, no matter what color or what sex you are. And he wrote about a lot of the problems of democracy that we know and that we have to solve, and he was thinking about those problems in various ways, in saying that democracy was delusionary. He wrote to Engels about democracy in the States. Marx and Engels were great supporters of Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And they were very concerned about the re-election of Lincoln, who they've written to Lincoln too about their support in various ways. And it was Marx in a letter to Engels in 1864. They were worried about whether Lincoln would be re-elected. He was, you probably know. But Marx said, quoting him, "But election time in a country which is the archetype of democratic humbug is full of hazards that may quite unexpectedly defy the logic of events." Now, he was a Democrat, and he wanted Lincoln to be elected with, wasn't really universal suffrage. You wonder what he'd think about democracy in America now. What kind of humbug he would find in the United States. But his view was that there was universal suffrage. He had some warnings against universal suffrage that people would think might change a parliament. And he called this parliamentary cretinism, that people think they could solve all their problems by electing their people to the parliament. But he said universal suffrage, etc., is required and permitted by logic, as I mentioned earlier. But then he goes on talking about the French, I think it was a French Workers' Party preamble. He says that the emancipation of the producing class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex and race. And then he says that, explains on that the emancipation is gained through the collective appropriation of the means of production, using all the means at the disposal of the proletariat, including universal suffrage, transformed from the instrument of deception into an instrument of emancipation. So that's what he wanted. Emancipatory, as I say, democracy. He talks about emancipatory universal suffrage. Well, there's a lot to say there. Let me just make a few remarks, and it's by way of confession that I chose the title for this book before I really knew what it meant, and then discovered that I think Marx had a pretty clear idea of what he meant here. I, like a lot of other philosophers, including the analytical movement, but elsewhere too, have spent a lot of time looking at freedom and liberty. And then it came along that people started talking about emancipatory things, emancipatory movements, emancipatory science. And I thought, being an analytical philosopher, that this is just nuisance fashion. Here, people are bringing in another word that means freedom, another way of saying it, and it just confuses things, because my background is that if you're using another language, another words, you must be thinking a little differently, or using another concept in doing that. Some philosophers will know how J.L. Austin's talked about these sorts of things, and he had a lot of influence on me. But if you have two concepts, you'll have two concepts if you have two words, generally. Well, we got over it with freedom and liberty, because the great books on freedom and liberty say, we're going to talk about liberty, and there are two kinds of freedom. That blew my mind a little bit, but that's what Berlin, the great author of freedom, says. So there are two words, and I got used to that. And then they bring in emancipation. I tried to figure out, I didn't really know what emancipation was. I spent all my time in freedom and maybe liberty on that. My view now is that emancipation is something that is carried on for a whole group. A group is emancipated, but not an individual. The slaves in the Emancipation Proclamation were emancipated, not the individual slave, who might be liberated, might gain freedom, but they're emancipated. And then, by the way, there are a whole bunch of other things about what you say after that group is emancipated. Do they get a little more emancipated? Or do they fight for more emancipation? That's what we say about freedom, and that's what surely Marx wanted and what we want too, to expand our freedom more and more. What socialism does when it gets rid of the fetters that it has. It doesn't expand emancipation. So there's a subtle point here, one that I think Marx knew about, that I wish I had time to write even more about that issue, but it would have been too difficult for anyone except those who want to look at these minute details to go through. But I'm one of those people, but I don't want to bother others with that sort of thing. But the point I want to make is that Marx had a new idea about democracy, that it must be emancipatory. And I think I do say a fair amount in my book, in criticism of socialists who now say, all we need is participatory democracy, we add that and we can get socialism. Well, I think that's not very helpful. It's too vague. It's too limited. And that's one of the things that Marx was concerned about. We want emancipatory democracy, and that means other things about freeing from wage slavery and gaining to new societies. I have a number of things about new societies in my book too. I think there's some linguistic mistakes or difficulties there. But it's the democracy that is a core part of Marx's writings, when he's always thought to have been in favor of some kind of dictatorship. No, that's what followed him, and people said, I'm a Marxist, I'm the leader, I'm the vanguard, I'm the dictator, rather than we want self-emancipation and universal suffrage and all of that, and emancipation to free association of community workers, which I think is Marx's view. So my message in this and what I try to promote is read the guy. Read Karl Marx's work. It's fascinating, interesting, it raises new problems. He doesn't solve the problems. He gives us concepts and ways of looking at problems that should help us try to deal with a world that must be at least as bad as his world was. So I'm going to continue to read Marx, and I hope you will continue as well. Thank you very much.